Gotcha.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great. It's kind of crazy to think I've been at REAP for 7 years now, recognizing a bunch of names here on the screen, but some new ones as well. So appreciate all of you who are able to join us today. And this is being recorded. So if you have to leave early or you want to share this with folks after the fact, it will be available for that. Greg's pretty good about getting that uploaded right away and then sending that out after the fact. So, of course, I'm glad that we do have some folks here so you guys can help me out with this as we talk about measuring energy use. So in the past, last year, actually, I gave a webinar on energy saving tips. And so this is not necessarily focused on exactly how to reduce your energy use. You can check that out on some other resources that I share throughout, but really thinking about measuring our energy use. And this is part of our AK Energy Smart program, which is funded by Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. And I'm sure if you're here today, you're familiar with REAP. We're a Renewable Energy Alaska project. There are 10 of us that work at REAP, hopefully soon to be 12. We're growing, and as we're growing, we're also looking at growing renewable energy and energy efficiency in Alaska. We do this through a variety of ways, including collaboration, education, training, and advocacy. Of course, my job on the education side, I focus on K through 12 education, but also doing more adult education. And as Greg mentioned, teacher trainings as well. Today is also Dia de los Muertos, which I think is appropriate considering also thinking about the ancestors who have been before us and also the ancestors who have stewarded this land and continue to steward this land with Alaska Natives. So really diverse cultures who have been here for thousands of years. I personally am in Betna, which means between the lakes outside of Wasilla. It's also where I grew up on Denina El Nena. So I hope that you are also familiar with your own traditional native lands. If you'd like to throw an introduction of yourself in the chat, I'd love to see that, who you are, where you're from, native lands. There's an organization that you're associated with, and then folks can see that in the chat. Make sure that you're selecting, although Greg, I don't think, can everybody? Oh yeah, okay. You should be able to select everyone and then send a chat message there. We also, of course, have the Q&A box. So as we go along, I'll try to watch the chat for things that come up, but it is super helpful if you have a specific question that you'd like me to address to use that Q&A feature. So then if we miss something in the chat as it scrolls on, it's still held there in the Q&A. Although I am sitting here and watching it, so we'll do my best. Great to see so many folks. All right. So here's our outline thinking about this session today. Done our introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we want to think about measuring our energy use and how we can do that specifically for heating and electricity. We're going to be thinking about this through residential energy use. And I'm hoping that it's not calculus. All right, so I threw up this like complicated looking equation up there because I'm trying to make it a little bit simpler. I'd have some simple resources that you can be able to use to measure your energy use so that it is not feeling like a foreign language. And I'm planning on leaving about 15-20 minutes at the end for Q&A, although I will do my best to address questions as they come up throughout as well. And Greg, there's also some great energy educators on the line, including my coworker Tyler Katzmar and Clay Good. And Greg Siegel has my links ready to go to throw in, as I mentioned, resources as well. So the reason why I think about this is if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. I can't say that I came up with this phrase myself, but I certainly like it as we think about our energy use. If you want to be able to manage and use less energy, you have to understand how much that you're using. And we want to use less energy because through efficiency and conservation. So this is either your behavior change or improved technology that uses less energy. If we have less efficiency and conservation, that's the cheapest and lowest carbon fuel that you're able to use. At REAP, even though our name is Renewable Energy Alaska Project, we very much talk about efficiency first all of the time. That's your free fuel. The only free fuel you're going to get really is your efficiency. So we like to think about it this way, but also not just for the cost, but also for reduced carbon use of fossil fuels, can have more comfortable home, better air quality. There's a lot of benefits to this. But again, all of that is not possible unless you understand how much energy that you're using. So I really recommend, if you're not familiar with this energy saving tips booklet, to have this download. It's a free PDF download. Greg's going to throw the link to that in the chat. It's available on our website. There's one that was, this was updated this year, 2022. So if you haven't seen it in a little bit, this is an updated version. It has tips specific for Alaska, for Alaskan homes, I should say, around heating, water, lighting, and other electricity use. And we also developed a home energy checklist that's at the end. So even if maybe you're really good at energy savings, there might be a couple things in there to help you or to share with others who maybe want a nice introduction into energy savings. So that's our why. This is why we're doing it. And there's this resource to get you started there for how to do it. But we're going to be thinking about measuring our energy use. Now, if we think about our energy use for transportation, that's super easy. We think about miles per gallon, or for those of us with electric vehicles, we might think about miles per kilowatt hour. And so that's pretty straightforward. And I'm not going to be spending a whole lot of time on that today. But I'm going to be thinking about heating and electricity. So heating, at least in the United States, we compare our heating use in British thermal units. I'll talk a bit more about that and what that means in a bit. Think about cords of wood, gallons of heating oil, or cubic feet of natural gas, typically. And then for electricity, we're thinking about kilowatt hours. So this is our amount of energy used over time, and that's our utilities, our electric utilities charge us per kilowatt hour. So we'll be thinking about how we can measure these different types of energy use. Yeah, so Kat asked a question about having somebody trained on an air-based heat pump, and that's definitely a longer conversation about having workforce development that I'm not sure that I have a great answer to, but I'll keep that in mind and think about that, because I do have a slide here on heat pumps as we go through. So from the energy saving tips for Alaskan, this is from there. We are looking at, most of us, it looks like, are in South Central, although we have some folks as well in Southeast, which is fantastic. Love seeing that. And here in South Central, most of our energy costs are around space heating. So 73%. For those of you in Southeast, it's a little bit lower, around 69%. But we also have this other energy usage around water heating and appliances. So heating is the biggest area that for energy savings, where we can save the most money, but it can be the hardest, the trickiest to actually be able to implement and actually measure. So British thermal units, if you're not familiar with this, it's this like weirdly specific British American unit that is about the amount of energy in one match. So if you heard of a BTU before, that's kind of the general measurement that we think about this. And so we can compare how much energy different fuel sources have for heating if we think about cubic feet of natural gas, gallons of heating oil, or cords of wood. And I also threw in on the bottom here, heat loss. I asked a mechanical engineer who designs heating systems for schools and hospitals, among other things. I asked him, I said, okay, so I'm doing this, webinar on heating energy use. Do you still use British thermal units? Is that the thing? He said, yep, we use British thermal units. We use BTUs. And he's generally looking at it in terms of heat loss. So how much heat loss does a building use? And this is just a funny side note. When I asked him about this, he said, yeah, we use MBH, which stands for milli BTUs per hour. And so milli being a French term with a British unit used in the US. So that's just how our heating systems go. So if you get confused, you're not alone. And hopefully you can be able to use some comparisons and think about this in some new ways as I go through this. So one of the biggest things for measuring your energy use is if you get a bill, use it, check it, look at it, see how much that you're actually using. For those of us who get natural gas from NSTAR, we can see how many CCF or cubic feet, 100 cubic feet, centrum cubic feet, we are actually use each month. And so we can compare that over different months. It's a little bit small on the bottom left here, but you can see they also have a comparison over the past year. So you can see this is my October heating bill. You can see it started going up, of course, after September, but is similar to October in a previous year. And so that's kind of a good way too, to be looking at, okay, is this a reasonable amount? Is this how much we're actually using compared to previous years? And so that's one way to start at that, is looking at it. And you're looking for this number, the CCF of 57, for how much it's using. And then if you want to get diving deeper into comparing with BTUs, that British thermal unit, there's this known amount of BTUs, 103,000 BTUs approximately per CCF of natural gas. So of course, not all of us are fortunate to have local, relatively inexpensive natural gas where we live. So a lot of places do use wood for heating, or actually here where I live, we use wood as an extra heating source to offset some of our natural gas use because we have abundant dead spruce near where I live. So I'm able to use that. And I'm wondering if you know what the recommended percentage of moisture is for wood. You know what that recommended amount is? It's a percentage of moisture. I can throw that in the chat. Okay, Jean says 19, George 25, 15. Yep. Yeah, y'all are right in that range. They say less than 20% is what they recommend. And yeah, curing for at least a year. That's great, Allison. And so depending on where you live and your normal air moisture content, you might say like 6 months to a year. I was just in Cordova, and apparently the recommendation there is 3 years because of how humid it is there. But if you want to be able to get really specific, especially if you use wood as your primary heating source, you can get a moisture meter for 20 or 30 bucks, and you can stick this into different pieces of wood and see if it is if it is around that 20% or less of your heat of moisture. I just pulled mine out. I have pulled one out. I checked a log that I was about to put on a fire. One log was like at 6% and the other was at 10%. So I was feeling pretty good about that it had cured enough for that. Of course, mine started as dead wood, so that was good. So you want that less than 20%. And there is the BTU. So a cord of wood is a specific volume of wood. I forgot to put what that amount actually is here in there. But that volume of wood, that's how you get wood delivered, is per cord. And so there are some estimates on the BTUs per cord, which Greg, I believe I put that. Thanks, Kendra. Yep. 4 by 4 by 8 feet. And so there are different BTUs per cord of different species. So birch being the best, at least where in Alaska, for that BTUs for what we have available for us with white spruce, Sitka spruce on down. And so what they say is that you split, stack, and store to maximize that wood moisture. And so like Allison said, often here 6 months to a year for storing or longer. And that is how you're going to be able to get to that wood moisture content. And there is also, in terms of efficiency, you want to use an EPA certified wood stove to maximize that wood that you have so that it's super efficient, and also not putting as much pollution into the air when you're utilizing that wood. And of course, there are more BTUs in really dry wood because you're not having to boil off the water as much before it burns, and the harder woods, like I mentioned, like birch. Any questions so far? Like I said, I tried to not make it calculus. I also want to mention, if I didn't earlier, that if you have, there are a lot of experts here on the call as well around energy. So if you have things that you want to add to it, please do as we go along. I am an educator, but not an engineer or an energy auditor. So I can certainly miss a few things here and there. Appreciate collaboration on it. And so heat pumps. So this was mentioned earlier about heat pumps and being able to have somebody who can install it. And George Rowe recommended getting in touch with Thermalize Juneau, which is also part of Alaska Heat Smart, where I got this photo from. So that is a great great location to start if you're interested in heat pumps. And a heat pump is also known as a geo-exchange system. It transfers, not generates, heat from the air, ground, or water. Typically for housing systems, we see them from the air to air exchange, sometimes from the ground, and then water heat pumps or seawater heat pumps are normally on bigger systems like the Seward Sea Life Center has one. And like I said, they transfer heat. So it's sort of like a reverse refrigerator. If you think about the coils on the back of your refrigerator that get warm, and I call it the magic of thermodynamics, that it is able to transfer and capture heat out of the system, out of like air, ground, or water. They may not think of as very warm, but by using compression and the laws of thermodynamics, there is some heat that you can actually capture out of that and then transfer it. And so then you can get really high efficiencies by using heat pumps. Heat pumps work really well spring through fall in most places in Alaska, and even through the winter in some of the warmer climates, such as down in Southeast Alaska, as you guys are very familiar with. And you will find, if you are looking into this and thinking about heat pumps, you'll see an output in million BTUs, so that MMBTU. And if you, if you're interested in heat pumps, I can't remember if I gave this link to Greg, but since we are mentioning Thermalize Juneau and heat pumps, you can check out Alaska Heat Smart. Put the link in the chat there, and it talks about kind of some of these different types of heat pumps. Now, fuel oil is probably the second most common use of heating that you will see in Alaska after natural gas, at least in terms of number of households. And this one is in some ways easy to measure if you know how many gallons you get delivered. So you can just do number of gallons delivered divided by the days between deliveries, and you can get an average gallons used per day. But of course, that doesn't necessarily tell you how much you use each day. And there are some gadgets out there, some ways that you can have sensors that measure that. That starts getting a little bit more complicated. I believe that some folks in Fairbanks are doing a study on fuel oil heating at Alaska Center for Energy and Power, so they could help you out if you're interested in digging into that a little bit more. But in terms of our comparison of our energy use, a fuel oil is around 138,500 BTUs per gallon is what we see typically. And whether it's for fuel oil or any other type of heating, you can save 2% on your bill for every degree that you turn down the heat. I've also seen as high up to 3%, but around that 2% is what I see more commonly. For every degree you turn down the heat, you can save that for your bill. So that's a good way to be thinking about that, no matter what your heat source is. And so if we want to be able to calculate the costs of using some different energy, and if you're not, unless you're getting your bill from NSTAR, which I gave an example of before that shows you that really easy cost per month, You can also, there's two calculators that are out there, one for heat pumps, which Greg put on there, which is a fairly recent one. And so you can see what that might look like for you for installing a heat pump, if it would be financially feasible for you, at least roughly. And then there's also one for wood heating. The wood heating calculator is a little bit on the older side, and it only includes Alaska Peninsula, Bristol Bay, Copper River Valley, Southeast and Southwest. I think because maybe South Central has natural gas, I'm guessing. I'm not sure exactly why they didn't include them, but that can give you that idea of wood heating cost. And those are both free and available to use online so that you can actually, again, thinking about that measurement of your energy use, you can think about it in that way. What fuel sources, I should have asked this earlier, what fuel sources do you all use for your heating? Or at least for the, for the primary heating source. For me, it's natural gas. Okay, heat pump. Great, oil, yep. Wood, birch spruce mix. Diesel, so that's same as fuel oil. Yep. Yep. Okay, great. Yeah. Okay. There we go. So thinking about that. Okay, good. So hopefully I've hit something for each of you in terms of thinking about your heating use. And this has been, I've been thinking about, your direct energy use or direct costs for measuring this energy use. We can also look at some things on a more indirect level in terms of heat loss to be able to identify some areas for that savings. And so one of them is by using an infrared camera. So here, this infrared camera picture on the bottom left is looking up at the ceiling, and you can see where it's cold, there is a lot of heat loss. And this contractor, energy auditor, opened up that attic and they could see that the insulation had been compressed and had some things on top of it, so it wasn't working as efficiently as possible. And they were able to make some quick fixes to that insulation so that it wasn't compressed any longer, and add some insulation and have these boxes and stuff on top of boards so that it was not compressing that insulation. And so that's one way you can measure. Another way you can think about measuring energy use is through an infrared camera. Of course, that's not something that's cheap to have, but we do recommend, especially if you have a home that's not quite as energy efficient, is doing an energy audit so you can identify these sorts of areas where there are major energy losses. And people who do energy audits have these infrared cameras that they typically can use to check for that. Can also measure some of your major appliances indirectly. So you can measure the temperature of your hot water. And to do this, you run the water on hot for 2 minutes. So to make sure that it gets the hottest water coming straight from your tank to whatever faucet that you're running. And then you can use a digital thermometer to measure that temperature. And you can do a similar thing with a refrigerator or freezer. They have these pretty inexpensive fridge freezer thermometers that you can get like at Home Depot's or Lowe's, I think for $5. And you can put that into this on a shelf and check it after it's acclimated. So you know whether you're within the ideal range, because if it's lower than it needs to be, you can turn it up a little bit. Same thing for the hot water heater. If it's much more than 120 degrees Fahrenheit, you can actually turn that temperature down. And if it's even all the way at 140, which is sometimes the standard temperature that it's set at when it's installed, if you turn it down to 120, you can save 6 to 10% on an energy bill. It's really important to not turn it down lower than 120 degrees for safety reasons. And of course, each situation might be a little bit different. If you have elders or immunocompromised folks living in your home, you might have to err on the side of a little bit warmer. But there is that way where you can check it using a digital thermometer to see if the temperature is actually what the setting is also saying that it's at. So Kendra, how realistic is it to install a heat pump? Depends on where you live. I believe you're in South Central here. So finding an installer, it can be tricky. And so, but it is certainly realistic. We built a barn this summer and I'm getting a heat pump to put in the barn to be able to heat part of that space. And so that would be, it depends on what your electricity source is as well, because it does take a lot of electricity, like around a hair dryer, a little bit more to be able to run a heat pump, from my understanding. Not having yet installed the heat pump, can't for sure speak, but that's my understanding. Yeah. With a 700 watt inverter, yeah, it might not be a large enough system for a heat pump, although you could see if there's a small heat pump. Henry, I'm not sure if you're asking Kendra, but if she's off grid, that means she's not paying for electricity to a utility, I think. But I'll get to electricity. Conveniently enough, electricity is my next slide. So any questions so far on heating or water heating that I've touched on here? Measuring energy use. Okay. I don't think I've seen anything come in through Q&A yet either. Okay, so electricity. Here's our next big one that we want to think about measuring our energy use. And so we're measuring, you can check the use of each individual electronic item. And so that can give you an idea of how much electricity different items are using. Sometimes the appliance's nameplate or tag has how many watts it's supposed to be using on it, or the max watts that it will use. You can also use, so here's an example of like an 8-watt LED light bulb or an 1100-watt blender. You can also use something called an electricity monitor. So here's just one brand. We also heard of things called kilowatt meters. That does the same thing, it's just a different brand. And you can get these, you could buy one, but you can also borrow them from Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. A lot of libraries have them. Most utilities have these available to borrow. So you can just call up customer services and ask if they have one that you can borrow. Most of the ones like MEA, AEL&P, Chugach Electric, I think those are some of the utilities, the folks where you're from, that's where they all have them available to borrow. And of course, you can also Google it. You can see what the good old Google machine tells you for how much electricity a different appliances use. So once you have that, then you can figure out your kilowatt hours, which is what the utilities charge you, right? So you want to know they charge us per kilowatt hour, and a kilowatt hour is another tricky unit, kind of like BTUs, thinking about our electricity use. Kilo is 1,000, of course, and then watts, that's our base unit that tells you how fast it's using electricity. And then if you know how long that you're using something, so the total number of hours over a given time, usually a month or a year that we think about, that will tell us our kilowatt hours, or kWh. And so one way to think about this is if you have something like I showed, the 1100-watt blender, say it's round down to 1,000 watts, that's 1 kilowatt. If I ran it for a whole hour, that would be 1 kilowatt hour. For 2 hours, that would be 2 kilowatt hours. And so that adds up over time. And that's what the utility says over a month. This is how many kilowatts that we measured that you use. And then there are different costs across Alaska. So again, if you need to know how to measure it, you need to know how much it costs you for where you live. So here are some of the costs that I have. Of course, this does not cover anywhere near every community in Alaska, but some of the ones that we've looked at recently, including Anchorage, Homer, Cordova, Juneau, and Bethel. And so you can see some of those costs for that dollars per kilowatt hour. Since we're not all completely connected together, that means that we pay different amounts of different rates for our electricity. So Juno's so low relatively because they are almost 100% on hydro, and that the hydro systems that they have are paid off. So they're older systems and they're not currently being paid for. So that cost has been recouped. So they don't have much fuel costs. Yep. And so they don't have much fuel costs, of course, being able to use that hydro and able to have that lower costs for their electricity. And so this is where you start thinking about the crossover of electricity and heating, such as, thanks Clay, yep, population concentration too. And so that, it's not spread out over a really large area, like for Matanuska Electric, over a very huge geological area that they are serving for their electricity and have those really long power lines that they have to maintain and service. Yep, thanks Clay, good point. And so when we're thinking about this crossover of heating and electricity in places where you have really high heating costs and potentially lower electricity costs, like in Juneau, things like heat pumps make a lot of sense, because even if you have to keep a smaller or backup system that's not using the heat pump, it can really pay itself off because of that lower electricity price. And someplace like in South Central, where we have relatively cheap natural gas and our electricity costs are not necessarily super low. I mean, they're not bad, but they're not really low, not like Juneau. Then they don't necessarily pay themselves off. I got a heat pump for a barn because it's not connected to our natural gas, and I was able to get a pretty small one, and I wanted to be able to use a heat pump. So for me, it wasn't necessarily just the payoff that made sense for me to purchase a heat pump for heating a small part of my barn. So when you look at an electric bill, there's a lot there, right? And so I've kind of highlighted two things here to look at. One of them is you want to be looking for what that total kilowatt hour usage is. So 268, as if you're not off grid, of course. Most of us are not off grid, getting electricity from one of our utilities. And so figuring out what that total kilowatt hour usage is. And if you're also not sure what your electricity rate is, you can find it out from the bill. It's not usually only on one line because there are different things that go into an electric bill and different costs. And so for here, I took this recent Chugach bill from a friend and added up those costs, and it was really close to 20 cents per kilowatt hour. And so this is that variable rate. How do you find that cost per kilowatt hour? And of course, a lot of utilities have it posted on their website as well, but maybe they include slightly different things on what they post on their website. So this is a really nice way to be able to check, just adding up all of those decimals to get that variable rate. And really you want to be looking at, again, this total kilowatt hour usage. And this is really on the low side. This is someone who's really energy efficient, perhaps traveling a lot in October. The average electric utility bill is around 550 kilowatt hours per month. Obviously, that can be more or less depending on the size of the house, people there, climate, time of year. But we kind of say on average 550 kilowatt hours per month. And so what's really nice also about your electric bill is that you can look at your usage over the past year or since you've had the house. So this person had bought the house in April, and so they have their usage since then, since they were connected to that electric. And it can help you identify trends or notice if something is really far off for a month. The other thing is that most utilities now have online portals where you can look at your electricity on a day-to-day or even hour-to-hour or 15-minute increments. And they have some really cool tools to be able to do that energy usage explorer. So I know my utility, Matanuska Electric, has that. Chugach Electric has that. Many others have it or are getting that. And it's a really nice way to be able to see where something is like, why did my power spike suddenly at 1 a.m. or something? Or, oh yeah, I went on vacation, I left on this day. And so can see if my electric use didn't go down as much, maybe there's something weird going on. So that's another way to look at that, measuring your electricity use. Here's actually one of my bills. We have a solar system that we installed last year. And so wanted to show this example because it has a little bit different look to it, because it's the kilowatt hours that they delivered versus the kilowatt hours credited. And so for our house, we use more kilowatt hours. We have 2 electric vehicles, so we have higher electricity usage. And then, but we also generated nearly 300 kilowatt hours in June. And so we only had to pay for that 407 kilowatt hours. That was the difference of that. So definitely helps us with our bill on electricity. Okay, so I'm going to show a quick example here of our costs, of how you can calculate the costs. And I use the fun example of the Arctic Star, which if you've been in Anchorage in the winter time, you've probably noticed this on the east, up on Arctic Valley. And so this is a star that Fort Rich, the base, maintains and puts up. They turn it on the day after Thanksgiving, and they leave it on, twilight through the night until it's light again. So about 16 hours a day, every day until the last mushroom on the Iditarod makes it to Nome. And so we've estimated that if the base paid residential electricity rates, which they probably don't, but that's what we're going by to compare here, is how much money would it cost to power it? So there's they use 370 10-watt LED lights that are on for 16 hours a day. And we've already seen that Chugach Electric charges 20 cents per kilowatt hour. Again, this is if they paid residential rates. And so there's a simple equation. I'm going to show you an easier way to do this, but just for sake of, so you can see my math here. You just multiply number of watts times hours times days and the dollars per kilowatt hour, and we get $1,300, a little over $1,300 per winter that they pay for that, which is a chunk of change. However, this is when they're using LED lights. Up until 2020, they were actually using incandescent light bulbs. So if we did that same math, but with 75 watts per bulb, that cost was actually at $10,300 per winter at that 20 cents per kilowatt hour. So being able to measure your energy use and calculate that cost. Now I'm going to assume that most of you don't have, 300 bulbs, 350 bulbs on 16 hours a day, right, through the winter. But it does help you understand that scale, and understanding that cost and being able to do those calculations and measurements can really help you understand how much or if something will save you a lot of money. So we have this brand new electricity use calculator. This is the first time it is being shared publicly, electric use calculator. We've been playing with it and putting it together, and we have this now electric use calculator where you can put in your utility rate and different items, and it will automatically calculate the cost for you for the day, month, or year. And you can add a bunch of items to a list. So even if you want to see like how much everything in your living room costs you, or if you want to compare 2 different types of appliances and what the costs are, then you can do this on this electricity use calculator. So I really hope that you guys use this and share it with others, because we tried to make it simple. And if you have feedback, to let us know as well. And Greg put that link in the chat, so I highly recommend you guys checking that out and using it as for that electricity use measurement. Okay, so in terms of measurement, you can also get like cool gadgets, right? So you could get a smart thermostat, energy monitor that gets installed into your circuit breaker, and has a web app that tells you specifically how much electricity different things are using. You can get an infrared camera for your phone or as a standalone. There's some really cool gadgets out there that, if you're really into this and want to use, you can. The only one of these that I use is a smart thermostat, and actually it's only my mom's because she's gone for part of the year. So it's really nice for me to be able to remotely monitor per house temperature since I live close by. Otherwise, we don't have, I'm not using these other gadgets, but they're there. So if you want to dig into it, that's cool. There's some cool stuff to be able to use. I do want to say, though, that we can use some really simple tools to be able to measure and therefore manage our energy use. So looking at your energy bill each month or whenever fuel is delivered, however it is that you're getting your energy, take advantage of those free tools like the online portal and usage data. Start becoming aware of your habits and usage. And then you can use some tools if you want to be able to measure things really specifically, like an electricity monitor, a fridge or a freezer thermometer, digital thermometer. And then once you're able to measure and identify those things that are using a lot of energy, you can start reducing and saving on that energy. So while there's cool gadgets, you don't have to have those really fancy gadgets to be able to manage that. There's also some resources, also not comprehensive. And this doesn't include some of the stuff that Greg already put in the chat, but additional ones I didn't necessarily mention. Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, Alaska Heat Smart. UAF has great sustainable energy classes. So hopefully this kind of gets that question about, well, what's the answer to not having an installer for a heat pump? Well, let's do some more education, which doesn't really help. Let's do workforce development. It's a lot of education of people who would be able to do it, but don't know a demand, and also people who just don't understand what's out there. So not a great or quick answer, but something that I do encourage. And of course, REAP's website, which probably all have been to already, but there it is. And so that is the last of my presentation. Gunoshtish, Koyana, Besicho. And I'm going to stop my share for now to answer some questions or have other folks share some of their thoughts or experiences with measuring energy use. I know today I just focused on residential energy use, but there's certainly a lot out there on the commercial scale as well. And Greg, were there any questions that I missed that I didn't address?
I think you nailed them all. Yeah, I don't see any in the Q&A chat, but yeah, folks, please feel free to jump in and ask some questions. Use that Q&A feature or just drop comments and questions in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one question or one comment. Oh yeah. A new Navian combi boiler installed. Yeah, that, I guess one more link, if you can drop in the chat for me, Greg, is, like I said, I didn't get too much into the tips for saving energy. I did a webinar on some of the best tips for saving energy last year, which Greg's put in the chat, and that energy saving tips booklet are really great. Okay, so do you have any recommendations regarding approaches for instrumenting circuits or circuit boxes in homes? So when I was preparing for this presentation, I did find a link to kind of a review of different, put that in here, a link to that, electricity monitors, including ones that are in the circuit breaker, that talked about a couple different versions of that. They said it was, if you are, familiar with basic electrical safety, you could potentially install this yourself or have somebody install it for you fairly easily, and that it was really intuitive use once it was installed onto your app. I know one person who did this a couple years ago and really liked, I don't know about the brand that she used, but I know she really liked what she was able to get from it. So I hope that sort of answers your question, George. Yeah, okay, thanks, Clay. So the importance of backup heat in homes for air source heat pumps retrofits. So ASHP, being air source heat pumps, are, of course, right now in Alaska generally retrofits. I don't know of homes which are being built solely with these yet, although maybe it's happening, I'm not sure. Mostly it's people who are getting retrofitting. And so it's really because air source heat pumps don't necessarily work down to the coldest temperatures of the year. it is very important to still maintain some sort of backup heat, whether that's something that you had existing already, like an oil stove, or if you have wood or some other type of backup heat that you still have, because they don't necessarily work down to the coldest temperatures. Yeah, and then Henry talks about energy loss with a blower door test and smoke test. Yep, that's really important. You see that energy assessors and auditors use that technique. I did, and so again, energy audit is a great way to get a really accurate measurement of energy in your home. Not something most people are going to be doing with a blower door test. And then let's see another question in the Q&A.
I think
Yep.
that's for me there. So yeah, we'll post this recording. Probably get it on YouTube this afternoon or this evening, and then I'll send an email out, a auto-generated email from Zoom that will, thank you, and I'll add the link into that email. So you should have that email by tomorrow.
Right. Thanks, Greg. And yeah, I'm happy to share the slide deck as well. And let's see, question about, I haven't heard any talk of restoring the home energy rebate program. However, there is interest in a green bank, which would potentially work, could include a program like that. I don't know, Greg, if you have a handy link to a green bank intro or information about what a green bank is, if you're not familiar with that term. But there is some funding in that Infrastructure Reduction Act for National Green Bank, which we are hopeful we could use as seed funding or support for an Alaska State Bank, which could support something like a home energy rebate or other energy efficiency and renewable energy residential and commercial projects. And then Kat asked about cooperation among Alaska's electric utilities working. I think actually that'd be more of a question for Greg, who sat in on some of those meetings. And for me, I don't know if you have an update or nothing new going on there.
Sorry, I was looking for a green bank link. What was the question?
Kat asked, how's the cooperation among Alaska's electric utilities working?
Okay, well, unrelated. I think it's slightly unrelated to today's discussion, but yeah, there is ongoing efforts to connect the rail belt grid utilities in a more collaborative way. So there's a electric reliability organization that's been certificated by the Regulatory Commission, and yeah, we definitely put out information on that via blogs and newsletters, and we've hosted past speaker series events on those, posted on our YouTube page. So I'd recommend checking those out to learn some more, and happy to chat more about it, but we'll save that conversation for another time.
Yep. Okay, further questions or things that I missed? Like I said, there's lots of experts here. So anything I missed, especially on residential energy side for measuring or monitoring energy use? I think I found a green bank info link as well.
Well, yeah, if we don't have a whole lot more questions, we can wrap things up. If you have any last minute questions, feel free to drop them in the chat here. And yeah, I want to thank you, Colleen, for sharing this great info. Excited about that calculator. I haven't actually used it yet, so I'm excited to use it, and a couple of these others I haven't seen. So appreciate you having these links available for us to use. And yeah, we've got one more speaker series event coming up in 2 weeks. 2 weeks from today, we'll be talking about renewable portfolio standard. REAP is putting forth suggested legislation for a renewable portfolio standard that we're hoping will get introduced in this session, and we'll be discussing that legislation. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining us on our lunch break, and thank you to Colleen. I see a couple of last minute questions.
Yeah,
Maybe
I'll do a couple last minute. George reminded me about phantom loads. Thank you. I should have included that in my presentation, so I appreciate that. Phantom loads are being something that is using energy even when it's not on or when you don't need it anymore. So George gave an excellent example of heat tape left on during the summer, and or things like cable boxes use a lot of energy even when they're not on. We used to think about phantom loads and sometimes our small appliances, but newer technologies, it's not as bad. But things like heat tapes left on over the summer, really important ones. And so that's a good one where looking at your electric bill, having things on timers, or reminders to unplug things like heat tapes in the summer are really good. And so that's an important one, that phantom or vampire load. So we've just come out of Halloween, All Hallows Eve. That's a good one to be thinking about. And then Henry's question, have batteries been improved to use for, I guess, for storing energy from solar panels? Maybe is the question. And I think, I'm not sure compared to when that you're thinking of, they certainly have improved, but it's generally not, unless you're off grid and don't have access to a utility grid, it's usually not cost effective to have batteries with your solar panels. So like the solar panels that I have don't have batteries, and so they are straight into the grid instead of being stored in batteries. Although I sort of have batteries in my house with an electric car, so I can have that as backup, but not quite the same as I think what you're asking about. Okay, other questions, comments? Really appreciate everyone's time and hope we get to see you at the next speaker series. And please do reach out if you would like a presentation about efficiency. I do that a lot in communities and school visits, so.
Great. Thank you, Colleen. Appreciate the presentation.
Bye, Anna.
All right. Have a good rest of the day, everybody.